This is the story of the beginnings of farming God's way. Brian Aldreve was a young man, very proud young man. He played Zimbabwe cricket and he eventually became a very successful tobacco grower. He had a very large farm in the north of Zimbabwe on the sandveld, very suitable climate and soil type for growing tobacco. One day he was sitting around his dining room table and his daughter said to him, "Dad, on the back of a cigarette box today, I saw that it said poison." And he said to her, "Yes, my girl, you must never ever smoke. It's not the right thing to do. It's very bad for your health." She looked at him and said, "Dad, but you grow tobacco to put a cigarette in the mouth of everybody in the whole world in a day." And he was so cut to the quick, he didn't know what to say. He shuffled around and he tried to make some excuses, but it never worked. That night he couldn't sleep, he couldn't rest, and he went walking in his tobacco lands. In the field there that night, he made a covenant with God and he said, "God, I will never again put another leaf of tobacco in the ground again." Incredible faith, incredible full persuasion to leave a good legacy behind. Brian's decision cost him severely. He was totally humbled. He ended up growing food crops that failed year after year. They had 2 successive droughts. The bank manager called him in and said, "Brian, you've got to stop growing these food crops. You've got to go back to growing tobacco. If you grow tobacco, we'll support you. If you're not, we're going to take the farm away from you." Sure enough, Brian's full persuasion kept him on his tracks. And he never stopped. He never went back on his covenant with God. But you see, there's another deeper part of the story. If we turn to God, we can't only turn in our hearts and with our mouths, we've also got to turn in our actions. In 1982, Brian Aldreve took a position as the farm manager of this farm, Hinton Estate. He found after a short period of time that the farm was in exactly the same position as his previous farm had been. The yields were declining, the costs were going up, and the farm hadn't made a profit for a few seasons. He was very worried because he just lost his previous farm. They planted a brand new area of soya. It was this particular tract of land on my right hand side. They had a typical African storm after a few weeks, and this deluge caused massive amounts of seed to be washed out of the soil, and the soil was lying all over this road like this. He was devastated, and he went to the owner of the farm, the widow, and he said to her, "We've got a big problem. We just lost this field to this deluge." And she said, "Which field is it?" He told her which one. She looked at him and said, "Brian, don't worry about it. It happens every year." And he was so cut to the quick with those words that he realized that we've been unfaithful with the very first talent that God has given us. He came back to the land and he looked at it and he began to understand God's heart. And he cried out to God and he said, "God, what must I do?" It was in that moment, that beautiful moment, it's like God replied to him and said, "Brian, it's about time you asked." And with God, He's got a solution for everything. We just got to come to Him and ask. And they went on a journey together in a very nearby forest here. And at that place, God exposed to him how to farm God's way. Well, we found ourselves in the very same forest where God spoke to Brian Aldreve. It's so special to be under the shade canopy. This is God's garden. God is the master farmer. You know, no matter what happens, whether there's a political crisis, whether there's economic downturn, whether there's a drought, whether there's heavy rainfall and deluges, this forest is never in need of anything. One has to understand how that works, and Brian was shown that by God in this very same place. The leaves fall from the trees, the twigs rot off, and fall to the ground, all adding to what we call God's blanket. Even in the savannas, the felt grasses die back and they add to God's blanket continually. So what is so important about God's blanket? It's God's wonder. We call it God's gold. It's so special to us because we understand its value. The raindrops come and they strike this beautiful blanket, absorbing its impact, stopping the compaction and crusting that takes place on the surface of the soil, allowing for that deep penetration. Underneath the blanket, you find beautiful things like these fungal organisms living inside the soil. If you have a closer look, you'll find lots of fungal mycelia in here. These are all holding and binding the soil and releasing its nutrients into this tree canopy. Inside the soil itself as well, there are organisms that are working together to be able to make this soil so friable. I've never worked the soil before and I can pick it up with my hands. You go into an agricultural land, you try and do that. The soil's lost all of its beautiful texture, it's lost its fertility. We've been making bricks out of our lands when God is busy building up, always building His soil. This is so precious to Him. We've got to learn to consider that God's ways are so far higher than our ways. We just got to turn and follow after Him wholeheartedly. In the forest where God farms, there's no plowing, there's no burning of the forest floor mulch covers. We've got to turn wholeheartedly to God. And it was at this point where Brian realized that he had to go and try doing farming God's way on a large scale. It took a lot of faith, and he did it exceptionally well. After God had shown Brian how he does his farming in creation, Brian then went and did some research and heard all about the American Dust Bowl and how they had stopped plowing. Then he heard about that these guys had come from the States and taught in Zimbabwe 10 years prior to his learning from God in creation. These guys said, "It will never work, Brian. You're going to suffer with compaction, there's going to be weed problems, there's going to be terrible stands, and you're going to struggle with pests and disease." He was so convinced and fully persuaded in his heart. He said, "There's no way. I've got to do what God's shown me to do." And so he started small, and he did it to a high standard. He just did 2 hectares in his first season, and he excelled, exceedingly above what he thought he would ever achieve. What's so amazing about this story is that Hinton made a profit in that year where it hadn't made a profit for several years, just by turning to the first foundation stone of those 2 hectares. They expanded the following year to 50 hectares on this Hinton estate. Thereafter expanding to 100 hectares, then 200 hectares, then 500 hectares, and ultimately the whole farm. But it didn't just end there. The neighboring farmers all around this whole district were commercial farmers, and they were, just like in the past, just leaning on their own understanding. This is a thing that we had to learn in this story, is that if we continue to lean on our own understanding and not be faithful with a little, God's going to take it away from us. And Brian started to call in the neighboring commercial farmers, and he said, "Come guys, come and have a look at what's going on. It's so exciting. God's shown us what we should do." And they were so proud and they were so hard of heart, they wouldn't listen. They said, "Brian, you've just been here for 2 years. This is 1984. Been here for 2 years. You want to start telling us what to do? Our fathers have been here before you and our grandfathers before them. So don't come along and start telling us your fancy stuff." And their hearts were hard, and they were proud men. And slowly but surely, the neighboring farmers in this district started to go under. And because Hinton was turned around by God's blessing, turning to farming God's way, the trustees started to buy up the neighboring farms. And Hinton Estate went from being 1,000 hectares to 3,500 hectares under cropped land. It's a wonderful success story. The key secret is to start small and be faithful with a little. Now, when Brian Aldry first started doing farming God's way, didn't have fancy implements to be able to implement it at all. So what they did was they used what they had in their hand. See, the hoe is the secret. God encourages us in His Word even to use what we've got always. And by using what you've got faithfully, you can succeed. Initially, when they did their first 2 hectares, they did it with a hoe. When they went to 50 hectares, they did it with a hoe again. Again, 100, 200, 500, and ultimately 650 hectares were all done with this hoe. Incredible story, really. As they expanded into more mechanized implements, but it never started there. And this is the great encouragement that we have for the poorest of the poor. You can do it. It's actually been proven that by using a hoe, you can do it more effectively than you can using very expensive machinery. Very significant part of Brian Aldrief's story was when he first came to the farm, he had 2 white managers that were on the property. Both of them were trying to undermine him, they were trying to undercut him and make him fail. Both of them ended up, one in prison and another got fired. And at that point, Brian decided not to re-employ white managers, but to employ black managers. On my right-hand side here is Norman Biri, and this is Vedra Kapia. These 2 men are men of God. They love the Lord, and they've been discipled and mentored by Brian Aldrief over the years. Brian hasn't been on the farm for how many years, Norman?
For 10.
Over 10 years. And yet Norman is still on this property, and he's still exercising the faithfulness that he was taught by Brian Aldrief so many years ago. It's a part of the heart that we've got to get. We've got to learn to really believe in men like Norman and Vedra. We've got to really believe that black Africans can do it. You see, if we've got the faith in us to believe that they will succeed. And if we don't have the faith, they will never realize their God-given gift. It's our heart towards them that allows them to express their gift in God. And I would encourage you to stop having an outlook that is patronizing and considering in an alternative motive, but to really start to believe in the black African people. If we don't believe it, we will never see the African people come out of poverty. But we have seen on countless expressions throughout the continent that when we give that wholehearted faith in our brothers, that they realize their gift. Norman on this huge property now is exercising faithfulness in some of the most difficult conditions that Zimbabwe has ever experienced. There's no fuel, there's no inputs in fertilizer and seed, and yet we've been driving around this property. It's a testimony to Norman's faithfulness. It's an incredible story, and I just want to encourage you that the people that you're serving in the community where you are can also do it.
Where I'm standing now, it's a rockland, and they came with the idea from asking God for zero-till. So this place, it's now working very nice. I always bring my grandchildren here and show them and tell them how good is God. If we work with God, everything can come very well. It used to be a poor land. Now it's a wonderful land because there's no plowing. It's only tillage. That's why I said God is wonderful for us. If we work with Him, everything can be wonderful to us. So that is all that I can say. Thank you.
What a joy it is for me to stand in this beautiful crop like this of soybeans, where at Hinton Estate, where I've been discipled by Brian Aldrief and Norman Biri, who are the champions of farming God soil. I was employed by Brian Aldrief at Hinton Estate in 1994, employed as a chemical mixer, and from there I grew up being discipled, and Brian, seeing my faith, he promoted me to become a farm carburetor. From there I started to minister to many communities in Zimbabwe and throughout the nation, and I rejoice in doing that because it's God's way.
We're in the boardroom of Hinton Estate. This is where Brian discipled and trained his managers in farming God's way. He taught them to plan ahead. He taught them to keep accurate records. He taught them the management principles of doing things on time at high standards, without wastage, and with joy. Brian achieved amazing successes at Hinton Estate. They got up to 13.9 tonnes a hectare with maize and 5-6 tonnes a hectare with soyas. And they really excelled. They won many prizes and awards in Zimbabwe. They had international visitors coming from Canada and the United States just to come and look at Hinton. It became the postage stamp farm in Zimbabwe. However, Brian began to look across the river and he began to see situations like this where the poor in the communities surrounding Hinton were getting poorer and poorer and poorer. And the Lord really put a deep compassion in his heart. His first year he went out and did training in the community. Then they implemented and planted a whole Farming God's Way tract of land, 1 hectare of land. At the end of the year they came to see and rejoice with the people about the harvest and compare it to how their traditional methods were going. When they got there they found it was a jungle of weeds. The maize was tiny, it had never been tended or managed at all. So the second year they decided to come in again and do the same thing and just to come and reinforce the training. The second time, exactly the same thing happened. Total crop failure. When they went to go and inquire in the community why, when everything had already been done for them, why should it fail? They discovered that there were 2 major elements. A deep-seated jealousy in the person that they had chosen to help resulted in him being almost cursed in the community, and people got witch doctors from the community to come and put juju, the potions and the things that the witch doctors do on the corners of the land. So he refused to go in even and weed the land because he was so fearful. It was just an eye-opener to Brian as he began to realize that Farming God's Way is not just a technology. We can't roll out the principles of no ploughing, no burning, the practicing of rotations. That's not it. There's a fuller picture here that can only be exposed when we start to understand that when we do things God's way, it begins in the heart. One has to understand that farming and living is all about coming out of the abundance of our hearts as we walk with God. And so if we've got blindness, we can look across a river and see 13.9 tonnes a hectare of maize, and we won't believe in our own hearts that we can actually do it. Whereas when God, through the Son, through Jesus, comes and he opens up our eyes, he unveils and he takes the scales off us so we can see the glory of Christ. And in so doing, we can turn and begin to doing things God's way. In that way, we start to understand his creation and appreciate the beauty of it. We really appreciate the fact that God's blanket lies on the surface of the ground and there's no ploughing. That in God's creation there's high levels of management, and in every aspect of life we begin to implement the fullness of God's way.
Now the ways of God have been hidden, let them be revealed. The promises, walk in it, shine bright, let your glory fill this land. Faith, hope, you know that the blessings are coming.
The beautiful thing about the story of Farming God's Way is that the body of Christ finally got hold of this kingdom message and have been able to take it into many nations, being able to impart this message to the poorest of the poor who are now lifting up their heads, and the glory of God is being revealed on the land. The truth is, the journey has only just begun.